Welcome to Talking Point from the Church's Fellowship for Psychical and Spiritual Studies.
Teachers who returned from the dead. J. Duncan M. Derrett. Dr. Derrett is Emeritus Professor of Oriental Laws at the University of London and has published many studies of Buddhist literature and New Testament texts. This episode first appeared as an article in the December 2005 edition of the Christian Parapsychologist Journal and may reflect the language and attitudes of the time in which it was written. Responsibility for opinions expressed herein rests solely with the author, and such opinions must not be taken to represent those of the CFPSS. There is evidence from Christian and Buddhist sources that deceased persons were heard to teach. Putting this evidence together, we can see what is implied, but before we do this, I want to recount a story related on television. A medical student walking in an obscure part of London was encountered by two Asians. One began to choke and collapsed. The student took out his penknife, opened the windpipe, a dangerous experiment, inserted another object, a pen, and asked a bystander to summon an ambulance. By what turned out to be a fine tracheotomy, the man's life was saved. The Asians were brothers, Iranians with scanty English. One was asked by the TV commentator what he thought about the affair. He replied that whoever the man was, he had no idea. He was a bird from heaven, in plain English, an angel. The lad's mother would not dispute this, and who are we to argue with her? How we express an experience will vary with our culture. Asians prefer picturesque representations to bald narration. The conversion of St. Paul, previously Saul, is to be considered in this light. Saul of Tarsus. A rationalist will say that on the way to Damascus to carry out his nasty assignment, Saul realized that the intended victims were right. They had acquired truth and were enlightened, the immediate source being Jesus. If Saul changed horses in midstream, he ceased to be the equivalent of a junior member of the then Jewish version of the Stasi of the GDR, one among many petty bureaucrats, and became the chief of an international mission. That the shock of the discovery should produce a temporary ischemic embolism of an optic artery would not be anomalous or surprising. The rationalist will continue that since the idea cannot have come from his associates, it obviously came from without, as the discoveries of genius seem to do, and since no other authority existed, save the dispersed community in Jerusalem, the established idiom of Hebrew literature was to hand, and the voice, as with that to Samuel, 1 Samuel 3:10, came from God. The people who held the truth were the intended victims of Paul's mission, and their teacher was the one to reprove Paul, in the current idiom, reproof being phrased as a question, and, by reproving him, abort the mission and set on foot a movement counter to the high priests. According to Paul's own accounts, no human origin for his agency existed. In Luke's opinion, a man at Damascus called Ananias acted as an instrument in Paul's recovery. But Paul himself ignored this and understood his commission to derive from Christ in person, in terms drawn from the prophets. Acts 26:15-18 ends, to open their eyes, that they may turn from darkness to light and from the power of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and a place amongst those who are sanctified by faith in me. In the same chapter, Paul assures King Agrippa that he always believed in the resurrection from the dead. That Jesus conversed with Ananias himself is stated at Acts 9:10-16, where the progress of the mission is clearly outlined, a message which Ananias embroidered at Acts 22:14-16, and compare with Galatians 1:16. Luke himself believed that Christ appeared from the dead to teach the disciples on the road to Emmaus. The rationalist will say that sooner or later disciples must have discovered that if the Christian message, which was objected to on many grounds, Acts 28:22, could be supported by citations from other, deceased, prophets from Moses onwards, the task of evangelization would be eased. So we have from the earliest Christian testimony the tradition that the teacher can come back from the dead to enlighten otherwise perplexed or misguided hearers. Buddhist comparisons. The Buddhist position provides interesting comparisons. To come back from the dead means, specifically, to leave the heaven called Tusita, to re-enter the smelly and dusty world of mortals, and to utter a message. The latter turns out to be a restatement of Buddhist doctrine, which in the Buddha Gautama's lifetime secured, in a roundabout way, his own approval of verbalizations of Buddhism as understood in that heaven. Gautama himself did not appear after his death. His teaching was completed before he died, and he left fully instructed disciples to carry on his work. But it was possible for Devas to perform similar functions. Devas, literally gods, but really godlings, sometimes rendered angels, have unimpeded movement. Perhaps the most famous lay follower of Gautama was a man called Sudatta who acquired the pseudonym Anathapindika, meaning he who feeds the helpless. Curiosity about Gautama's teaching caused him, not without hesitation, which an invisible voice reprehended, to take extraordinary pains to meet the master and ultimately provide a place where the first Buddhist church might lodge, the forerunner of monasteries. He fell seriously ill and called for Gautama's pupil, Sariputta. The latter gave him a lecture on withdrawing from consciousness of the body and indeed from worldly concerns. The patient's condition did not improve, but he had hardly passed away when he was reborn as a deva in the Tusita heaven. In that guise he visited the Buddha and gave a poetical recital of the Buddhist faith, showing that, though never a monk, he achieved what many a monk must have missed. Though dead, Anathapindika was, and no doubt remained, the teacher, whose arrival was signalized, as with all devas visiting the earth, with an extraordinary brightness illuminating the environment. They were, in all senses, enlighteners. Hetaka too became a deva and lectured devas in heaven. But the skeptic Payasi took up almsgiving and was reborn as a deva in the mansion of the guardians of the quarters. He met a man licensed to visit that mansion and commissioned him to go back to earth and teach the optimum method of making gifts. Here the deva does not give his message personally but does so through an agent. Discussion. Returning to Christ, we notice that his appearances did not contain an account of the world of the dead, which he is supposed to have visited, or of the judgment. One who has been resurrected from the dead might be expected to have a tale to tell, as does the imaginary character the Pamphylian in the 10th book of Plato's Republic, and the joker invented by Giovanni Boccaccio, who discovered that purgatory took no account of sex between co-sponsors, contrary to canon law. Paul says at 1 Corinthians 15 that Christ was raised on the third day, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then to more than 500 brethren at one time, then to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all to Paul himself, the least of the apostles. Paul had persecuted the church, but by the grace of God he was what he was, not in vain, for he had worked harder than any of the others. Paul does not tell us what was said at these multiple appearances, which some suppose to have been non-physical in spite of John 20:19-29, and leaves us to assume that nothing was heard by the disciples to conflict with what Paul understood on the road to Damascus. Moreover, the frequent mention of apostles suggests the meetings primarily concerned the mission. If so, they confirmed the message which Jesus himself had been spreading and sending others out to spread, see Mark 1:38, and 3:14, Matthew 10:5-23, and Luke 8:1. Whether we look to Buddhist or to Christian experiences, we confirm a delightful maxim derived from the blood of Abel, and improved upon by the blood of Christ, Hebrews 11:4, and 12:24. The dead, provided they convey the authentic message, in Christ's case the new covenant, being dead, yet speak. This facility is taken for granted by Abraham in his celebrated debate with the rich man in Luke 16:30-31. He ends it by saying, if they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will pay no heed even if someone should rise from the dead, and preach to them. In this picturesque way Luke confirms the scene on the road to Emmaus. The teaching of the truth is capable of being shared between the dead and the living. Receptivity to it, being problematical, suggests it will continue indefinitely. If you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more on faith, spirituality, and the unexplained. And if you'd like to go deeper, why not become a member of the Church's Fellowship for Psychical and Spiritual Studies? For just £5, you'll get access to over 2,000 titles in print and audio. Visit churchesfellowship.co.uk/membership to find out more.
You have been listening to Talking Point from the Church's Fellowship for Psychical and Spiritual Studies. To find out more, please visit www.churchesfellowship.co.uk.